today we're gathered at a rather propitious moment in the history of our country. For the first time in our country's history, we actually have a national broadband plan. And that national broadband plan is certainly a catalyst for a lot of conversations all across the country, in communities, in city halls, in the Beltway in Washington. And it all gets grounded where real people live, in places like Cleveland, Ohio, here in University Circle. And so part of what we want to do this morning in our first panel is actually provide a bit of a context for what is going on in the national scene and as well as in the regional scene around broadband activities, so that the students, as well as all of you here, have again, some kind of a framework for making sense of what we're doing here in University Circle and what we hope to do throughout Northeast Ohio in the not only national context, but also in the international context. So I want to introduce our first panel, who are going to take us through some of that level setting. Again, I refer you to the program for detailed backgrounds, just so that I don't have to spend all of the 40 minutes we have introducing them, because their backgrounds are, I think, genuinely and authentically that impressive. Jim Baller is in the middle of sitting between Joanne and Scot, and I want to just start with Jim. Jim is what I call the godfather of the U.S. Broadband Coalition. He is, without a doubt, the single, not only longest engaged legal authority in broadband in the country, but to whom all of us, both in the legal community, in the public policy community, in the academic community, all have looked to Jim for many decades, as he has oftentimes sojourned alone, and now we're very much pleased to be working with him. He also heads up the U.S., as I say, the U.S. Broadband Coalition, and we're going to open with some comments from Jim about the U.S. Broadband Coalition. Next to Jim, on his right, is Joanne Hovis. Joanne, in addition to having a day job, is also engaged as the leader of NATOA, a national association that I'm going to also ask Joanne to talk about. Again, she also has a national view of what is going on in the public policy arena, and it will help us frame some of the national broadband policy. Scot Rourke, who's on my immediate right, is the CEO and president of One Community, our very own not-for-profit regional internet service provider. And Scot will be providing a bit of a context for how the stuff that Jim and Joanne are talking about materializes and makes sense in our own backyard. Let me invite everybody who's standing up at the back to find a seat and get comfortable. We're in for some conversation this morning, so you're welcome to get comfortable. Those of you sitting in the back of the church pews are welcome to come forward so you get nice and cozy here along the way. You got to get some coffee. That's good. Good. And feel free to refill. So, Jim, why don't you just start us off with just telling us a little bit about the U.S. Broadband Coalition, and maybe sort of help us understand what's going on across the country.
Let me start by saying how honored I feel and how privileged. I'm the most fortunate attorney in the United States, if not the whole world, to be associated every day with people like Lev and Scot and Joanne. My professional background in this field began as a result of representing communities that a century ago electrified themselves, including Cleveland. Then electricity was the must-have technology of the day. The private sector focused on their most lucrative markets and literally left most of America in the dark. At that point, some 3,000 communities stepped forward, created their own energy futures by building and operating their own electric utilities. Some 2,000 of those are still operating their own utilities today, and they saw the communications field repeating the experience that they'd experienced a century ago. And so those were my origins in this field, and the parallels were absolutely startling. The ways that municipal involvement in this field were characterized by the private sector a century ago exactly the same way as they are sometimes characterized today. Municipalities can't do this sort of thing. They have multiple advantages that the private sector doesn't have. And if we can say some years out that the private sector and that public sector have worked together as successfully as it turns out that we have in the electric field, we will be disappointed, because it took 50 years for all Americans to have reasonable access to the benefits of electricity. We can't wait that long. The world is shrinking. We are in a competitive global environment. Many countries are doing things that we aspire to be doing. We need to do them. As Adlai Stevenson said many years ago, Americans can see the writing on the wall only when their backs are up against it. And we can't do it that way. We needed a national strategy. We needed a national dialogue. We needed for all of us to come together to have the kind of debates every day and in all contexts the way that we've been debating for the last several years, and it's happening now, and I couldn't be more excited. Lev mentioned the U.S. Broadband Coalition. What that is a group of 160 organizations that we put together 24 months or so ago, originally by one-on-one communications with entities of all kinds, large and small providers, high-tech companies, utilities, local governments, labor unions. We talk to them one-on-one. What can you do with broadband? How much better could the world be if you had access to affordable bandwidth in high amounts? And there were many themes that ran through. So we did questionnaires. We began to hold small meetings, and energy grew between us. By December of 2008, there were 60 of us at that point in time. We introduced on Capitol Hill a call to action to the President and Congress and the nation to develop a national broadband strategy. We emphasized that one was urgently needed. America's competitors across the world were each developing national strategies. We needed to establish high goals. We needed to work together in the public and private sectors. We needed to get it done. And we needed to stimulate deployment. We needed to stimulate adoption and use. We needed to respect the need of providers to manage their networks appropriately while at the same time making their networks as open as possible. And 2 or 3 months later, Congress enacted the so-called Recovery Act, as we referred to it. It had a provision requiring the Federal Communications to develop a national broadband plan. The department went on and developed such a plan. Eric Garr will be here later to tell us all about that. Is it a perfect plan? No, it's not a perfect plan. No plan will ever be perfect, but it is a brilliant plan in some ways, and it is a modest plan in some ways. What the plan does...
Jim, let me before we go too far down what the plan does, and we will give Eric a chance, let me just ask you to kind of back out just a little bit and share with the audience here and at the House and online sort of a contextualization. I mean, in what way do you think the conversation that we had about developing broadband policy in this country differs from sort of the international conversation? Provide a bit of a context of how public policy in this country perhaps is shaped through, the nuances of how decisions get made here in a slightly more international context.
Well, each country is different, and let me just give a couple of examples.
Sure.
The year 2001 is a very important year for many reasons. It's the year that one community launched itself. It's the year that the city of Bristol, Virginia, created a fiber to the home network. It's the year that the administration in Washington, the incoming administration, decided that private sector alone would be all that we needed to meet our nation's needs for advanced communication services and internet connectivity, and adopted a policy that lasted throughout the decade of the first decade of 2000, a laissez-faire policy, dismantling regulation to the extent possible, and letting hope for competition between the cable and telecommunications industries push us forward to meet our national needs. In stark contrast, and by the way, let me say that as of the year 2001, America was very much in the forefront of leadership in the broadband field. We had invented the internet here in this country, and in the 1990s, we were the unchallenged leaders in the world in access to broadband connectivity. A country across the other side of the world at that point in time, Japan, was way behind. They had just a few thousand broadband lines, and they thought they needed to do something about it. Right next door, the country of Korea had made broadband a national priority, and what we referred to at the time of the miracle of Korea was happening, and the leadership of Japan said, we can't let this go. This is a tremendous opportunity for us. And so in 2001, the government and the leadership of the private sector in Japan got together and said, we will declare as a national goal that we want the best infrastructure in the world within 5 years. And they mounted a national effort supported by tax incentives, by low interest loans, by a campaign of public education. They had their banking institutions think about broadband in long terms rather than in short terms. They made a national commitment to having the best broadband infrastructure in the world, and they did it, and it didn't take 5 years to do that. Then, once that was called their E-Japan initiative. Once they had that broadband infrastructure in place, they had a second initiative. This time they said, we will have what we call the Ubiquitous Japan Initiative, U-Japan. That initiative contemplated that broadband would be seamlessly available everywhere, ubiquitously. And second, there was a second meaning to ubiquitous, that broadband would be part of the solution of all of the nation's issues, major challenges: energy security, environmental protection, services for an aging population, healthcare, transportation. Broadband they conceived of as being part of the solution of everything. And while we were leaving our broadband future to the private sector alone, Japan mounted a national commitment to using broadband for all those purposes.
So Jim, I'm going to stop you there just because I'm sure it'll provoke questions about Japan size versus America. What do you think about that? Other examples. So during our question and answer, folks, those who are at the back, let me invite you to come take a seat at the front of the church pew here. It'll serve you right for coming a little late. I just want to turn to Joanne and let I see I'm not getting any takers. Joanne, maybe this sort of conversation of the role of the public option is a good chance and opportunity to segue to you, and maybe just take a moment to describe NATOA, and then share your own thoughts about the role of the public option.
Thanks. NATOA is the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors. It's the association in Washington that represents local communities on communications matters. And it's 30 years old this year. And NATOA came from the world in which the private sector was building out cable systems in the 1970s and 1980s. And NATOA represented the people within local communities and local governments who were regulating cable operators, because cable was to some extent regulated locally rather than at the state level or at the federal level. It also represented the people in the community who were very interested in this new technology and who wanted to be sure that the new technology was serving the community. And built into the way the federal government regulated cable in those early days and gave authority to the local governments to regulate cable was this idea that there were local needs and local interests and important public interests that should be met through the cable system, that as the private sector was building, it was using public property, that's the rights of way, that your taxes maintain, your streets, your sidewalks, other kinds of property, and that there should be some kind of a public interest obligation that came with having access to all that public property. That's a little bit of the history. The reason it's relevant is because we've really taken a very big step backwards broadly over the past 10 or 15 years in the way we think about the public interest and communications. For the most part, communications in the United States is offered by the private sector. That's fine, that's as it should be, and our private sector functions very well, does exactly what we want it to do. That is great, but we have stopped thinking about public interest obligations. We've stopped thinking about the best interests of the nation and the local community as being built into private sector efforts as well. We've really, I think Jim did a really nice job of describing how we've leaned in one direction rather than thinking about the fact that broadband and communications are not just a matter of profit-making and entertainment. They are a matter of national interest. The central insight of the Obama administration that is so important and is such an important change, and this, by the way, doesn't reflect my politics. I disagree with them on many other things, but on this core issue, I think there's this incredibly important insight, this idea that broadband and technology are foundational to every aspect of economic development, community development, energy, as Jim said, aging, healthcare, and every other aspect of what we do as a nation, and that if we are not strong there, for national interest purposes and for public interest purposes, not just for private interest purposes, we are not strong. So how does local government come into this? Well, that local regulation with respect to cable had an incredibly important outcome in a bunch of different ways. The one that I consider most important is that, how many of you here get your internet at home from cable modem service? Quite a few. The cable industry loves to talk about how it reaches 92% of the population of the United States. And it does. It gets to 92% of homes with this older broadband technology, but this very important and most common broadband technology in the country. The reason it does that is because local governments were empowered by federal law to require that when the cable industry built its networks, it built to everybody, not just to the wealthiest parts of the community. Now, there's nothing wrong with what the private sector would have done had it not been regulated. It would have done exactly what the private sector is supposed to do, which is to try to maximize profits by building to the places where the return on investment would be greatest. But because there was some element of recognition that there was a public interest, and there was enforcement of that public interest and those obligations by local governments, cable companies had to build out to the poor parts of town as well as the wealthy parts of town. We've backed off those commitments in Washington over the past few years as well. And hopefully the National Broadband Plan takes us at least a little bit in the direction of going back to recognizing the national interest and the public interest. Frankly, I don't think it takes us as far as I would like to see it going. But that's the other place where the local role becomes very important, and we advocate for this within NATOA as well. That local communities, represented by local governments, local nonprofits, universities, consortia, and collaborations of all these different groups, need to be empowered and funded and protected to fill some of these gaps where the private sector is not going, and to meet some of the needs that the private sector is not meeting, not just in unserved and underserved areas, but also to bring competition and to bring real innovation and stimulate our markets. Because what we've learned, to our detriment, as Jim described, is that backing off of private sector obligations to the public interest and empowering the private sector alone has, frankly, as a broad strategy, it simply hasn't worked. And that was the lesson of the past 15 years, and hopefully the National Broadband Plan gets us on the road toward correcting that.
Thanks, Joanne. That's terrific. So maybe then I can use this as the segue to invite Scott to share some remarks. Scott, what I hear between Jim and Joanne is this kind of interesting conversation about sort of the private sector and its role in the communications world, the public interest and its historic as well as current opportunity. One Community is certainly a hybrid kind of a model, and maybe you can describe a little bit about the model, although I suspect there are a number of people who know something about One Community in this audience, to sort of contextualize what One Community does in the context of what Jim and Joanne have just shared.
Sure, thanks, everybody. Yes, One Community is a nonprofit, and we actually are the internet service provider for about 1,500 regional institutions in what the broadband plan calls, or Obama administration in general calls, public interest. So we connect all the schools, the libraries, hospitals, and the likes, and we provide affordable, very robust services. So we're doing 40 gigabit connections to hospitals as an example. What I call it is a social enterprise. We do run a network. It is very, very similar to how the private sector is operated. It has to have the highest quality. We are serving hospitals, obviously, and they very much depend on it. 40 gigabit is not a trivial endeavor, so you'll see actually a lot of our partners are here at the highest end who also serve the biggest institutions in the country, public and private. So we have, it's really about the public-private partnership is where we're unique. I would say it first starts with our goals. Our goals are very different than the typical commercial provider. Our goal is to actually be a platform for innovation, to drive economic development, and simultaneously, we're addressing not just what I'll call the supply side of the market, we're also very interested in the demand side. So when Lev and I came here from essentially both from Silicon Valley in about 2001, 2002, we found that Cleveland was not, you'll be surprised, the world leader in the adoption of information technologies. So we realized we had to actually be market makers as well. And the private sector does not do anything, as best I can tell, to invest in developing the adoption and use of these enabling technologies. So really from an economic development perspective, we're at a huge competitive disadvantage, not just to improve health, government, and education, but even to innovate, to do a wealth of different things, safety even. So we actually, not far from here, started, from Lev's original idea, started really a community effort, public-private consortium really, and we actually link up other carriers. Our stimulus request was, we had over 30 carriers built into our request jointly. So it's very collaborative. We've got all the users involved. We connect City of Cleveland, the county, the clinic, UH, almost every public sector entity you can conceive of. In just 6 years, 1,500 of them. On top of it, we have robust programs that do regional IT strategies, regional healthcare in partnership with, I see Rosalind's invested in our education from the clinic. Rosalind's heavily invested in our regional education strategies. We've got regional health. And what happens and what makes the model sustainable, because that's what's difficult about a nonprofit model, is that actually drives the adoption on our Connect business. So it's actually a beautiful, very innovative, sustainable model where we're actually able to invest in the demand side, and that favors the typical private model. And at the same time, we're enabling the private sector to flourish, especially in rural markets where we're serving as what the broadband plan calls middle mile. We're basically just bringing the highway to a rural market and asking the private guys to say, use our highway, build all the off-roads, and go make a lot of money, and I'll be really your wholesaler. So we've got a variety of interesting things, but again, the key is collaboration, and we're looking for these social outcomes and use to derive all the benefits.
So, Jim, as you hear Scott, and I know this is not the first time you've heard Scott sort of talk about the One Community model, why don't you kind of, from an outsider's perspective, albeit not entirely dispassionate and objective on this one, sort of contextualize what you see going on in One Community and in Northeast Ohio, and what you see going on nationwide, and even whether you see the One Community model being closer to some other models that perhaps you've seen or read about or investigated elsewhere in the world.
First of all, let me say that I think extremely highly of the One Community model. In fact, we wrote a whole white paper about the One Community model, which we'd be glad to share with anyone. And we presented that white paper to the task force at the FCC developing the national plan and strongly urged them to consider this model as one of the models that could be replicated in other communities, that it had many benefits, particularly the benefit of blending together the best of the private and the public sectors. What's important here, I think we all would say, is that at the core of this is the value that networks are for a purpose, making the lives of the community better. And so this model is not necessarily community-owned, but it's community-driven, and that's critically important. Now, there's no one single model that will work everywhere. The one community model works here, and it can work in many similarly situated environments in the country. I would love to see other communities that are probing for ways to do what you're doing here, to learn from this model, take from it what works for them.
Joanne, any insights or reflections? Again, this is not the first time we've talked about the one community model. As you look across the nation and all the communities that both your company's involved with as well as your representation on the TOA, how would you contextualize what's going on in Northeast Ohio?
You're this really interesting hotbed of innovation here in terms of these models, both with respect to one community and what you're doing here with fiber to the home and what you're kicking off here today. One community is, I don't know that I would say it's entirely unique in its incredibly creative and alternative model, but it is in some ways really singular. It's a very prominent, very successful and important model. And I don't go to a lot of places where I see quite that model standing out in quite that way in the middle mile component. So there's
just for the audience that may not understand the middle mile, it is very prominent in Eric's broadband plan. We don't want to wait for Eric to describe middle mile, so just take a moment. Scott's mentioned it, now you've mentioned it, just sort of level set the middle mile just so the audience kind of understands why that's important, at least from your perspective.
So everybody uses different technology, and even the FCC and other agencies in Washington are defining these things in different ways. But generally speaking, that line or wireless connection that goes to your home or your business or your cell phone is what we call last mile. It's that last bit of build that has to happen to get you connected. Middle mile is the major, the big streets, maybe even the highways, not the interstates that cross the country, but the major highways that get you there. And when you have middle mile, this is one of the central insights of one community, when you have middle mile infrastructure available, particularly when it's very high capacity and affordable, it makes it much more affordable for last mile providers to go out and build that last mile to your home or to your wireless device. The lack of middle mile makes last mile prohibitively expensive. This is also another new recognition in Washington that is a great recognition, a very important one. And we're hoping that one of the things that comes from some of the stimulus projects that have been funded by the Department of Commerce over the past few months is that we'll see more examples, because their focus has very much been on building middle mile to enable last mile. And we're hoping to see that model proven out on a national scale in the way that Scott and his colleagues have done it here.
So Scott, I mean, what do you think some of the key pieces of secret sauce are in this formula? I'd like to think that one community is not singular in its exemplar, but maybe you can help us just understand some of the elements that make it an interesting hybrid model.
Well, I mentioned the word sharing, that actually the broadband plan addresses it, but this has been a problem. When we talk about sharing, we actually are talking about sharing assets. So actually we've got great examples of where people are, actually good and bad examples, where we've had governments help us and not help us, consciously not help us. So using assets like buildings, street poles. In Akron, we have a fabulous example. They co-invested in a big free public Wi-Fi and public safety network with us. They contributed capital. We're sharing fiber. We're sharing facilities. They gave us access to their street lamps. Alternatively, we've had other cities and other utilities that saw it as an opportunity to kind of gouge this philanthropy-driven endeavor. So with continued thought leadership out of Washington, D.C., including the plan, we're seeing the role of government being clearly defined. We didn't have that luxury when we started many years ago, but it's the roadmap's kind of, we were making it up as we were going along, but the roadmap's certainly coming in a little bit. Also, in addition to that example, or keeping that example, we also share the university invested, and they're actually doing our help desk for us there, for people that are trying to connect to the free network. So we, I guess to oversimplify it, it takes a village to raise a child. We define all the gaps first. We ask for people to chip in, and it's usually in kind. Certainly there has to be financial resources, but it's really a soup. Case's invested in so many things I can't even tell you, the clinic, and everybody, these are nonprofit entities investing in technology, which is one of our goals. And then we get to the meaningful use piece, which then creates more demand for the connect. And again, it's a sustainable model where we can actually thrive as a community, use technology where it drives the benefit, and then it's self-sustaining, if not accelerates upon itself.
Okay, so we spent the first half hour doing this big, hopefully interesting context of how this project that we're launching today kind of fits into at least 3 very interesting sets of insights. However, what we're doing today is not building out middle mile. What we're not talking about today is doing middle mile. For 6 years, Scot has been doing middle mile connectivity. We have 1,500 middle mile facilities in Northeast Ohio. What we're launching today is actually the last mile, but it's a different kind of last mile. So let me go back to, I start with Joanne, come back then to Jim, to kind of talk about fiber to the home, fiber to the premise, and what is that meaning when you look at what is going on nationwide. What else is going on in this gigabit fiber to the home world? Is there something, again, interesting about our model, or are there things that we should be learning from others in this model? So Joanne, why don't you start?
I think this is in many ways singular. So fiber to the home is the holy grail of communications infrastructure. Wireless is important. I always get that question when I talk about fiber. Wireless is important and an incredibly essential complementary technology. It is not a substitute for the kind of capacity and reliability that fiber to the home gives you. And fiber to the home is as good as it gets. I don't think in my lifetime we will see a transmission medium created that will supplant fiber. It's not the kind of technology that changes over a couple of years. It is something that we will continue to use for a really long time. And what you are doing here is truly unique in that you're not only building fiber to the home, but you're building it with public interest purposes, driving the decisions about how to build that fiber and how to use that fiber. So the incentives here are toward very high speeds, because this is a nonprofit community-based model. The incentives are toward making more capacity available, bringing in lots of different users and providers, bringing in lots of different potential service providers, and making more services available to the people in those homes. That is the unique part of what you're doing. Building fiber to the home is not that unique. Verizon is doing it in the wealthier parts of its footprint around the country. There are other providers that are doing it in smaller areas. What's unique about what you're doing here is that what motivates it is a whole different set of criteria, and it leads to different kinds of results. So for example, Verizon, and I give Verizon a lot of credit for its investments in fiber to the home in many parts of the country, but Verizon is not offering the kinds of speeds that Lev is talking about. It's offering fractions of that speed. And the Verizon people, well, the engineers have publicly said at the FCC, there's no engineering bar to us going to bigger speeds. It's the business decisions. We are maximizing profit. The business people are making decisions about keeping the speeds relatively modest compared to what Lev is talking about, because they will maximize profits in that way. What you're doing here is a different kind of endeavor, different kind of project, and so it will prove out the potential for fiber and the uses for fiber in different ways than the commercial networks, which are driven by different considerations.
Jim, do you want to add some insight on that?
Let's go back a century. Electricity. What could you do with electricity? Many people didn't know. The first use was lighting, and think of how transformative that was. And wasn't. People knew how to light their homes. They could do that with gas, they could do that with wood, they could do that with fire, they could do that with oil. So it wasn't transformative in the sense of bringing light. But now think of where we would be without all of the things that electricity unleashed. In the communications world now, people don't have yet a vision, generally, of what you can do with the lightning speed that fiber-to-the-home technology will give you. We, who think highly of it, think the way that the visionaries a century ago thought about electricity and created demonstration homes and took them out to the countryside to show people that with electricity you can do things that they could not envision. This project here and Google's projects and others that we hope will be cropping up will begin to show what you can do with all of that technology, with all of that bandwidth. With that bandwidth, as you will show here, you can do many things simultaneously at the same time. Developers will develop new uses that we can't even imagine today. But for that to happen, the platform has to be built. The technology has to be there. You don't build a fiber-to-the-home network overnight. By the time a network is built, if we were to start today, it would take 2 or 3 years at a minimum for it to be built out. Can we envision all the uses that will be available by that time? No, by no means. But once it's there, like electricity, we think it will unleash untold opportunity. Other countries around the world are getting that. You can already get in Japan, South Korea, many other countries today what our vision is of where the United States generally should be 10 years from now. This project is answering the call of the national plan to demonstrate, to show the world, to run test beds, to prove out what the visionaries among us say will happen. It is a wonderful opportunity, and the nation needs for this project to happen and others like it.
Thanks, Jim. I'd love to open the floor for a couple of questions from the audience here. Todd, if you or any of the students have some questions back at the Alpha House, just queue us up and we'll be happy to bring in your questions as well. We have microphones, so we're going to get them on the floor so that the audience around the world listening to us will have a chance as well. So we have a couple minutes for questions, and then we're actually going to do one of those amazing demonstrations just to kind of give folks a sense here that it's a whole lot more than just talking about it. Question. Introduce yourself if you wouldn't mind. Stand up, introduce yourself.
I have a question. How does any of this affect the incoming IPv6 that already is a mainstay in South Korea, Japan, even China?
Okay, so Joanne, you want to take a moment, or one of us can take a moment just to describe the IPv6? Do you want to just take a second? Or?
IPv6 is like 600,000 times as fast as our current internet.
Okay, well, let's just back that out. IPv6 is actually an addressing scheme. When you send out an email, or you actually want to have a device connect to the internet, it needs to actually have a specific address. Every device connected to the internet has a specific address. And today's scheme is called IPv4. And it turns out we've just about run out of addresses spaces available, all given the explosion of the internet. And so the new scheme is called IPv6. It has many, many more addresses available to us. And the work that we're doing here as part of our testbed activities here at Case Western Reserve is actually to begin working with IPv6, this new addressing scheme, because as you'll see at the house, if you decide to go visit the house, is that we actually have sensors that are smart. Sensors in the house that are talking to the internet. The house itself is talking to the internet. And it's not just computers. In fact, the computers may end up being the least important part of how all of this plays out. And so IPv6, I think, Joanne, in short measure, is absolutely part of the future as we get billions of devices talking to the internet, as opposed to the hundreds of millions that we currently experience.
Talking to the internet, not through a router?
The detail. Mike.
Hi, I'm Mike Stofsky. I chair the IP and technology practice at Ulmer & Byrne. One concern I have is that our national policy be consistent. So on the one hand, we've got concerns about open access, and then on the other hand, we've got the National Broadband Initiative. So if we're going to tell carriers, for-profit carriers, that they can't or should not discriminate on the basis of price, for different levels of access, for example, how do we also incentivize them to build out the last mile? And are the two concepts consistent with each other?
I'll let Jim or Joanne take a run at that.
So the FCC has an open proceeding called In the Matter of an Open Internet, which gets at some of this. The phrase that's frequently used is network neutrality, and it's a whole bunch of different things around how we see the future of the infrastructure layers of our communications world. If IPv6 and all the applications and everything else are here, they're all running on these core layers of fiber optics and wireless networks and routers and switches, the actual stuff, the infrastructure. And the question around this is, given that most of this is owned by just a few companies, how much control are they going to have over the content and over how much choice we have in the content we get? And we don't really have a lot of choices because we don't have a lot of competition. So if we don't like something that our carrier is doing, we can't really switch to a whole bunch of others. And that's what that proceeding is just very broadly about. How do we incentivize them given these kinds of restrictions, I think, is the question. It's not yet clear what will come out of this proceeding, but many people believe that these are not really restrictions. They are just a return to a very open and dynamic internet in which there was not controlled by just a few companies, and that this is an attempt to make sure that those companies don't use what is essentially monopoly power to monitor, manipulate, and otherwise use our use of the internet and to train our internet use in certain directions towards certain kinds of commercial outcomes for those companies.
Joanne, we're going to leave that for because that's a question we can also ask Eric for sure. Last question for this morning's first panel. And
Reverend B.A. Gregg, Cleveland School of Science and Medicine. Our students have asked, with the recent explosion in terms of internet usage and wireless phones and everything else, whether or not the infrastructure, the switches, the optics, the routers, if that's keeping up with the demand that we're seeing virtually.
go right ahead, Jim.
I'm so glad that you asked that question because I was hoping for an opportunity to say this. Dr. Jonas Salk once said that our greatest responsibility is to be good ancestors. Our kids are an asset of untold virtue and importance as they are around the world. Our kids need to be able to be competitive, to exercise their creativity, their skill. We need to give them more capacity than our present national network can sustain. If anything needed to demonstrate this could be more clearer, it is what's happened with the introduction of the iPhone and other smartphones over the last few years to show that our vision of what we need as a network that will support all those applications needs to be bucked up by a tremendous amount if we're going to be able to grow with the future. And do we have enough capacity now? Heck no. Do we need a lot more? Do we need it a lot faster than 2020? Absolutely. And it is projects like this that will help demonstrate that the demand is there, that the opportunity is there, and that we as a nation need to rise up. If we're going to be a great nation going forward, we need to do this, and we need to do it fast.
Great, thanks, Jim. Let's just give Joanne and Scott a chance for a closing remark as well, and then we'll actually do a demonstration with our students at the House and some work that Roz is leading us on. So.
Just really briefly, I think the existence of projects like this and One Community and other alternative visions that point a new way but also create little pricks of conscience and hopefully spur the existing industry, which tends to sit on its hands a lot, to do new things and to create new things, and hopefully will also spur competition, is just so essential. The openness and the opportunity for community networks and for nonprofit networks and for alternative models. And there's so many reasons. We've talked about many of them, but as I'm sitting here thinking about the question you asked a few minutes ago, that's one of the many questions is, are we about an open internet? Are we about a free and creative and innovative internet? Are we about lots of different models and a pluralistic approach to technology? Or are we about a few companies building the same stuff, maximizing their profits, and really holding the fate of the entire nation in many ways in their hands? And that, I think, is a lot of what's at stake here.
Great. Scott, last word to you.
I would say that we're really, we're going to connect folks, but we're at least as interested in what we can enable in partnership. So whether it's the great project you're going to see today, which is enabled by One Community, but really it's the community using it. So those here in the community that have an organization that might touch us in some way, or where we can help build a bunch of champions to go do a cool project, we would love to talk and continue to try and advance the use of technology for community benefit.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our first panel.